Welcome to Club E. Hi, I'm Rick Brimacombe of Brimacombe and Associates. I am your architect of business growth and will work with you to unlock your potential and amplify the scale of your company. Today in Club E, we are discussing the Director Series board topics of today. And part 5 is insights from a professional board member, Sven Wehrwein, and this is part 1 of a 2-part interview with Sven. Again, our goal for the Director Series is to support emerging and middle market companies and those in the business ecosystem who assist with their success. All right, I want to thank our sponsors, Irish Titan, an e-commerce and web development firm, Highland Bank, a locally owned community bank, Romaine Berg, a digital marketing agency, Schwegman, Lumberg, Woosner, an intellectual property law firm, and Voyager U, your gateway for building an independent work life. If you want to participate in today's session, you can submit your questions in the comments field if you're watching in YouTube. While you're there, please hit the subscribe and like button. And also, just to remind you, you can catch Club E on your favorite podcast platform, Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, and many others. All right, with that, I want to introduce today's guests. Welcome, Jim Zuehlke and Sven Wehrwein.
Thanks, Rick.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, gentlemen, thanks for joining us. If you are in YouTube, you can catch their email addresses. If not, it's Jim Z at cardinalboardservices.com and Sven Wehrwein. Sven is S-V-E-N, Wehrwein, W-E-H-R-W-E-I-N at Comcast.net. Jim is founder and president of Cardinal Board Services and my co-host of the Director Series. And Sven is a professional board member, currently sitting on 4 boards, 3 public and 1 private. Again, if you'd like to participate in today's session and you're in YouTube, go into the comments field and submit your questions. All right, let's start with you, Sven. As I mentioned, you're currently on 3 public and 1 private boards. In the past, you've been known as one of Minnesota's most active board members. You previously have served on 6 public boards, 4 private boards, and 10 nonprofit or government boards. That's a very impressive list. Tell us a little bit about what you did earlier in your career that prepared you for all that board service.
Well, Rick, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I've long been an admirer of what you do with Club E, so it's a pleasure to be here. I'm a finance guy in the vernacular. So I have a CPA. I worked for Coopers & Lybrand, now part of PwC, early in my career. And I went to graduate school in finance. And then I spent almost a decade in New York on Wall Street, taking companies public. And as I like to say, if that didn't work, we took them private. After my career on Wall Street, I also lived in London, working as an investment banker, and here in Minneapolis. Later on, CFO of 2 public companies, one of which worked out incredibly well, one of which didn't. So as we enter baseball season, I batted 500. And then for the last period of years, as you pointed out, I've made my living. I've given back by board service.
Well, you make the Hall of Fame batting 500 in baseball, and if you're in the CFO IPO world, that's pretty good too. Say, Sven, maybe tell our audience a little bit about what brought you to Minneapolis, given that you had been, as you said, in London and New York.
So the story has a little bit of a twist in that I was actually born in Denmark and came to this country when I was very young, hence the name Sven. But I was raised in Evanston, Illinois, and then had a couple of years at Edina High School. So Minneapolis roots go. So have now lived here for 30 plus years, live in Southwest Minneapolis, and thrilled to be in Minnesota.
All right. Well, thank you again for joining us. It's a privilege and a pleasure to have you here. So thanks again. Jim, you are the co-host on this Director Series. As I mentioned, we are on part number 5. Remind the viewers about what your background and your firm and what kind of work you do.
Great. Thanks, Rick, and thanks for having me, as always. I'm like Sven in a way, though, because I was born in Minnesota, but drifted away for a number of years. But as soon as we had that first baby, we drifted right back to Minnesota and have been here for a long, long time, for 35 years back, raising a family here and working here. So I started 10 years ago, started a company called Cardinal Board Services. I have a partner, Charlie, and we work with primarily private companies helping them upgrade their boards by recruiting board members, working through governance issues, other things like that. And have worked across the US and have done some public companies, but mostly it's private companies.
And then Jim, I know we've said it once or twice in the past, but your roots go down to southern Minnesota, as do mine, and I have a Zuehlke in my last name, so it's possible we are related going back.
We're still going to figure that out someday, Rick. I just know we are.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. So Sven, you seem to have a passion for early stage technology, information and medical companies that are poised to go public. Does that originate from your days in investment banking and a CFO? Is that your niche and why?
Well, you give me too much credit for being intentional.
Yeah.
I would tell you it was more of an accident how I got started. But to be clear, I was never a candidate for the board of a big company.
Okay.
Nobody ever recruited me for General Mills. I don't have that profile. I don't have that pedigree. Further, by instinct and by personal preference, I'm always a fan of the underdog. So I've always preferred to support teams and companies and opportunities where you're fighting against the big boys as opposed to being a big boy. I think both of you know, I also, when I worked in New York, I worked for a firm called Drexel Burnham, not for Morgan Stanley. So Drexel Burnham was the anti-establishment, Morgan Stanley was the establishment.
Yeah.
So it fits my personality and my background. With regard to the three companies that perhaps, Jim, you know me most well associated with, Compellent, SPS, and Protolabs. In each case, as I understand it, the conversation in the boardroom was, we're about to go public. Oh, shoot, though they might have used a stronger word. We need somebody to be audit committee chair. We need somebody who knows how to count. And wouldn't it be great if he had some other skills as well? So I was very lucky in being available, being identified, being recruited on the cusp of those three companies going public.
You know, the one thing though is sometimes that's what gets you there, but what keeps you there is usually something different. You know, what would you think is your value add for what keeps you there beyond just the guy that does the counting?
That's a great question, Jim. I guess what leaps to mind right away is that I view the work as a board member as a job. It's not a capstone to a career. It's not a reward for other things you might have done. To me, it's a job. And because it's a job, you show up and you show up prepared. You show up ready to do the work. You're not a high maintenance director who nobody can ever find. So I think consistently, as I think about my contributions, my participation at any of the companies that are part of my background, in each and every case, I've approached it as, this is a really serious thing you're doing. Have fun with it. Maybe make a buck or two. Hang out with some smart people, but it is a job.
Yep, got it. You know, as a recruiter, you know, for boards, we do primarily private companies, would have done public companies, and you've done public, private, nonprofit. Give us your perspective of how it's different as a board member being in those three different situations.
That's also a really insightful question. So public, as you both know, as the audience knows, is driven by quarterly reporting. So as an audit committee chair, there's a rhythm. I know my schedule to the end of 2022 for each of the public companies, because they know when they want to report earnings and you back up from there, and that's when the audit committee has to meet. So there is that cadence that drives a public company. In a private company, it's very different. First of all, you don't have quarterly audit committee meetings. Second, who is your client? In a public company, your client, to use today's word, is a variety of stakeholders. In a private company, your client, if you will, tends to be the owner. You're there at his pleasure or her pleasure. And if you do well, you stay. And if you don't do well, you might be asked to leave. Yeah. So it's a very different dynamic in terms of who you're listening to and who you're paying attention to.
You know, I've often heard that the difference between public and private for a board perspective is a public company has to be transparent and has to really present you with all the facts. Where a private company, you as a board member have to dig to get the real facts and the real what's really going on in the company. They don't have to give them to you. Do you find that to be true?
No, it's not quite been my experience. I think because the private companies I've been part of, you try to insist that they act like a public company. That if you're going to play the game, let's play the game at the highest level.
Yep.
And so
Yes.
perhaps going in, there's some misunderstandings or lack of conviction or commitment. But over time, you try and bring people along so that, again, if you want to be a major leaguer, act like a major leaguer.
Yep. Got it.
On the not-for-profits, it's such a different gig. You're there in part because you believe in mission, but then I also say in those contexts, no money, no mission. So you have to raise money. You have to be good stewards of people's dollars. You have to honor what they're doing when they write you that check. So I always tried to be the guy in the room that cared about both, cared about mission and cared about stewardship. Those tend to be very big boards, as you all know. So you have lots of constituencies. I guess the other thing I would say, in a couple of my not-for-profits, I came in with too many things I wanted to accomplish and was told to slow down. Give us some breathing room, Sven. We'll get there, but not today.
Well, Sven, having known you for a number of years, that is not surprising. I get that 100%. Say, Sven, I haven't served on a public company board. I've been on some privates and some nonprofit boards, but obviously, in addition to the differences that you covered, there's also a time commitment difference. Talk a little bit about the time that you have to put into these different types of boards.
Yeah. So I love this question, and recall what I said at the outset, Rick, that I'm a CPA, so I've got that gene. So a few years back, because I was curious about this, I kept track, believe it or not, for an entire year of every half hour of my time. I don't get paid that way, as I think most people know. Today, boards are paid retainers, and with equity, it's not a per meeting fee anymore. That's gone the way of all good things. So I literally kept track of every half hour for every board for an entire year, whether it was the audit committee or the comp committee, a board meeting, lunch with the CFO, et cetera, because I wanted to answer the question. And I was serving on a number of boards at that point. And interesting enough, the data all converged, regression to the mean, if you will, around 200 to 225 hours a year. Now, again, public company, I served on multiple committees. I was audit committee chair. Somebody who served on only one committee and was not a chair, she would have a lot less time invested. And it's also personal preference, right? I believe that having lunch periodically with a member of management away from a board meeting is an important part of the job. Did I include that in my 200 to 225 hours? Absolutely, because it was part of my work. Other people perhaps don't want to do that as often, or it's just not their style. But so it depends a little bit on what you count. I've seen this in the context of big companies and places like the Journal, and the 200 to 225 is consistent with what I read. Are people including their travel time in that number, for instance? I don't know, but it feels about right. If you consider a top flight executive, 40 hours, but let's use that number, 2,000. As a board member, I'm spending about 10% of what a top flight executive does.
That's interesting. And also, while I know you're a hard charger and driver, not surprised you kept those stats and have those numbers at hand. So
now, I only did it once because that spreadsheet got a little unwieldy or tedious after a while.
All right. Hey, Jim, how about you recruited for all these different kinds of boards? Anything to add there on the time perspective?
It's like Sven says, I love what he said to begin the talk with, is he takes this seriously as a job. This is work. Lots of executives, especially when they get on their first board, if they're a hard charging, executive that's still in their growth curve of their career, when you give them that information, because I use the same numbers, because Sven and I had lunch a couple of years ago and he had told me this exact story. And so they have to be ready for it. And when they go to ask their senior manager if it's okay to join this private company board, they need to know what they're asking for. I think that's excellent. I do see with, the board that I sit on, probably not 200 hours a year, but I also don't, but I think about, I don't typically count how often I'm talking to the CEO on the weekend or talking to the CFO and having coffee with them or whatever. But it's not 20 hours a year. It's not the 4 board meetings that are 5 hours each. It's not that. Because if that's what you're counting, you're not doing your job. You shouldn't be taking the money. And also with the nonprofits, like Sven said, you shouldn't be your governance. You should be leaning in a bit and understanding what the business is. And that's really an important thing, I think, for Sven as well, is that you got to care about the company and its mission, just like with and what they're doing. You better find it interesting, otherwise your value is going to diminish it. So we were talking a little bit about it at the beginning, the role of the audit committee chair. And I know that everyone, you're the audit committee chair, and that's why they asked you to begin with. But what do you think is really, I think of the different committees, and so I want you to talk about audit, but just in general, what do you think the value is of the committee structure that you see on public and private boards?
Jim, this is a rich question. I'm going to take us back to a column I read years ago by Tom Perkins of Kleiner Perkins Venture Capital fame.
Sure. Yeah.
And at that point in time, he was on the board of the old Hewlett Packard before it went through its various morphing. It's now 2 separate businesses. And he complained bitterly in this op-ed in the Journal, you can Google it, that the Hewlett Packard board had become too much of a compliance board, underscored, and then not enough of a guidance board. So 2 different mindsets. Are we in the compliance business or are we in the guidance business? And I would suggest to you that for a public company, you're in both. You don't have a choice but to be in the compliance business. You have to have an audit committee. You have to oversee the auditors. You have to oversee the preparation of the financial statements, and so on and so forth. So I think a really good board understands that they're in both businesses and that much of the compliance work then gets delegated to the committees so you can use more of the board time for the guidance piece of your job. In my particular case, I understand that an audit committee is in some people's views, a necessary evil. In other people's views, it's a way that we protect our system.
Right.
And therefore, that audit committee needs to function at a high level in partnership with the auditors and the management. But again, to me, the construct, thinking about what your job is, thinking about why you're there. Are you in the compliance business? Tom Perkins hated it because that wasn't what he did in his venture capital life. But as a public company director, understand that's part of what you do.
So Sven, what about when you look at the 3 public companies you're on today, of that 200 to 225 hours a year you spend, how many hours do you think you work on just committee work, like your audit committee work?
Jim, I'm not, probably half. I haven't looked at it for a while.
Okay.
Most public companies, as you know, average number of board meetings, absent acquisitions or divestitures, the steady diet, the calendar is sort of 5 board meetings a year, maybe 6. Board meetings 4 or 5 hours long. So your core board meetings, back to your arithmetic, is 25, 30 hours. It's all the work you do around that in preparation for that gets you up to the 200 plus measure.
Okay, good.
And then Sven, want to jump back to that compliance and guidance comment. Very interesting and one to think about. And obviously, public companies different than private, but curious, is it kind of turn one on, turn the other one on, and kind of go back and forth, toggle back and forth like a left brain, right brain, or you're always on, or do you skew compliance because of the public nature, or how do you view that that balance, if you will?
Let's see, I think you need to do both. And the most good boards use their committees to do some of that heavy lifting on the compliance stuff. The comp committee has a very specific set of charges, right? A very specific set of tasks. Everything from approving equity comp and cash raises to what goes in the so-called CDNA and the proxy. So they have a very detailed job to do. Audit, obviously the same. So to the extent you can, if you have a high functioning board and strong committee chairs, that heavy lifting is done in those committees, and then they report out regularly at a board meeting. but the other board members can relax and say, yeah, I know Sven's got audit committee. We don't need to worry about audit committee. Jim's got comp committee. We know Jim's got it, right? Because Jim cares about comp. He uses the right comp consultant. He looks at the detail. He's fair, and so on and so forth. So again, if you can get those kind of activities out of a board meeting, then your board meeting time can be used for higher level things.
Sure, makes sense to me. Jim, question for you. We heard some from Sven saying that a couple of the board slots that he was asked to join were driven by his audit committee experiences. When you do board searches, do you actually go out looking for members that can serve on specific committees?
Absolutely. We're actually in the middle of a public company, biotech company board search, and we've been asked by the CEO to say we need somebody that's got previous biotech comp committee experience, because we need someone to run our comp committee. We need somebody also to run our audit committee. So they're specifically looking for that, realizing they have no expertise on their board and in the house, and now they're public. Now, I would say on a private company, we get asked in a sort of a different way, because a lot of private companies have a full board, but the committee structure is a little bit more lax, I would generally say, than in a public company. So they might just look for somebody that's got a certain, but also fill an obligation they have on the board, or a hole they have on the board. Could be around digital marketing. It could be around technology, and they're still going to have them on it, but they also want them to serve on a committee as well. So public companies, absolutely, they ask for very specific backgrounds and maybe even served on committees. Private, it's more on specific experiences and what they could bring to that committee.
Hey, Jim, and a question back to you. In your experience with private companies, because you have more experience there than I do, how many committees does the average private company have? Do they have the traditional 3, audit, comp, and nom and gov, or do they just get by with 1 or 2?
They usually get by. They oftentimes combine some, usually a comp committee and an audit committee. But some of them have really unique committees as well. We work with some private companies where they have a specific committee around fundraising because they're in construction and real estate. So they're going to have that. That's going to be a finance committee that's focused on those issues. Or it could be something around technology, because they're a biotech company, so they might have something that's all around technology as well. So it's typically, if they have committees, and I've been with some that don't even have committees, it's usually comp and audit.
And Rick, you're on the board of Highland Bank.
Yeah.
Obviously a regulated institution. What is the committee structure with that? It's family owned, yes?
Yeah, family owned. So you have a layer that's interesting there. And then obviously with the banks and the regulations, there's a component of that. So we have a compensation and an audit. And then like you, Sven, we spend a lot of time inside meetings and lunches and calls and stuff. So comp and audit are the 2 committees that we have there.
You don't have a regulatory committee per se?
We don't have a specific one for that. We do get called on for our individual perspectives and experiences, but no, we don't have a specific committee for that.
So for instance, at AtriCure, one of the public companies that I'm lucky enough to be part of, medical device company, there is a separate committee that is a compliance quality committee reflecting the opportunities and risks in the medical device business.
I've also seen at banks, Rick, that they have a loan committee. I mean,
I'm at the board level, the loan committee, they do that at the operating company level, and so the board sees some of the stuff that rises up and doesn't see some of the others that does not make it there. So certainly these are things that are going on. We're just pulled into the 2 specific committees, and then kind of ad hoc get asked to join other meetings.
Yep. Okay. Hey, Sven, so you talked about the philosophy you have in going to on a board, but when you look around the boardroom, you've seen a lot of boardrooms. What's the value that a person, let's just say that I'm going to go on to a new board, and the advice you're going to give me, Jim, make sure you provide this kind of value to the board. And where's your head go with that kind of a situation?
Yeah, this is sort of one of my favorite questions. So if you guys don't mind, I'm going to spend a couple minutes on this because
Good.
I think there's some real value for everybody listening. As I think about board work, I've settled on sort of three tenets, TENETS, right? And the first one, you guys familiar with LIFO and FIFO as ways to value inventory?
Right.
Well, years ago, somebody ripped that off and coined NIFO, NIFO, noses in, fingers out.
Yeah.
So I think a really good board member thinks and adopts NIFO as one of his or her approaches to the work. You need to know what the hell is going on, but you're not the CFO, you're not the CEO, you're not running the business. Now, in a crisis, that changes. But as a steady diet, I think NIFO is a very good way to think about the work. Second tenet, if you will, is I stumbled across something years ago. It was a writing about the so-called Socratic Method. And I've adopted that for this context. And I would say, in paraphrasing, the Socratic Method is really a suggestion of keep asking questions. And if you don't sense that you have the truth, ask another question. And a really good CFO will finally say, well, Sven keeps asking that question. Maybe I better go do some more homework on that. So again, as a board member, I don't think it's your job to give orders. In fact, if you give orders, you're likely to find that they're going to be ignored because that's not your role. But if you're asking smart and good questions in a respectful way, but perhaps sometimes in a persistent way, that defines you, I think, as a high value-added board member. So Socratic Method. The third one that I would leave you and your audience with is the question of effectiveness. I've been on boards where there's people much smarter than any of us, yet that person isn't necessarily effective. Perhaps he's always the first to speak. Perhaps he is giving orders. And so one of the tests that I have for myself and others is, are you helping move the company from point A to point B and then point C? And sometimes I'm not the right person. Perhaps I've become a lightning rod. Perhaps it's not my area of expertise. So I've got to go to you, Rick, and say, I need help on this. I have a considered point of view, but I'm not sure I can be the one to give the nudge. Can you, in a sense, join forces with me? Or can you spend some time with the CEO? So again, to summarize, I think a really good board member thinks about NIFO, uses the Socratic Method, and measures herself against whether she's effective.
Excellent points. Excellent points. And this is how often do you see somebody who's not effective voluntarily leave the board because they get frustrated or they're putting their head against the wall or something?
Well, fortunately, I've been lucky enough to be on, excuse me, I've been lucky enough to be on boards that are high functioning. But I've been doing this long enough. I've been on 9 public boards, 5 private boards. At the end of last year, if you don't mind me sharing this, I had 70 years on public boards, so I've seen a lot of stuff. It's a good gig, and so people are reluctant to leave.
Right.
So it's very difficult for somebody to look in the mirror and say, my time is up. It's very difficult for somebody to say, I was a great contributor for whatever period of time, but my time has passed. So that requires process. It sometimes requires courage by the nominating and governance committee chair, or perhaps the board chair, if the nominating governance committee chair is the guy that's the problem. But so there's not a long line of people that are volunteering to leave a board. I remember talking once to a woman by the name of Susan Boren.
Sure.
Who was on the board. Some of you may remember her. She worked for many years for Spencer Stewart here in town. Very effective headhunter board consultant. And she was on the board of Valspar, which is, of course, no longer independent, for 18 years, and then she termed out. They had an 18-year term. And I can remember talking to Susan, and I sort of felt like there was a tear in the corner of her eye because she was really sad that her time with that company had come to an end. but they had a term limit and they enforced it. So for most people, leaving a board is not without some personal pain.
Yep. So Rick, what about you? When you look at the boards you've been involved with, kind of what's the value that you look at other board members, you bringing and then other board members bringing?
Sure. So I'm going to take two of Sven's, the NIFO and the Socratic Method, kind of blend it together. The looking ahead and asking questions, and then you can't ignore a question. You can ignore an assertion. So if you keep asking questions like, well, what if, and then what? Ultimately, you hopefully uncover what you're looking for, as Sven mentioned, and maybe even find some unintended consequences of whatever the line of thinking is. So totally agree, looking ahead, continuing to ask those questions. And then I think the concept of blending disparate data sources or connecting dots and taking something, the easy thing would say 1 + 1 = 4, and be able to look ahead for a variety of things. So that would be one thing. And then the last one, life is a series of problems. Nothing ever goes as planned. You put together these fabulous strategic plans, and then you get punched in the nose by all sorts of things happening. So creative problem solving, I think, is a very crucial ability for folks who are either going on boards or considering going on boards.
Okay.
And then to remind everybody, we can weave your questions into the conversation. So please join us in the comments field of YouTube. And I have one here. Sven, maybe talk to this question, and then Jim, I'll touch base with you on it too if you have anything to chime in on. Comment on the differences in liability risk to board members for publicly held and privately held company boards.
I'm not a lawyer, but for a public company board, well, for all boards, you should have D&O insurance, O for the officers and D for the directors. So as a board member, you should understand what that policy is and what your coverage is. I personally think the risk is much lower than people sometimes assert. There's only been a couple of companies in the couple decades I've been doing this work where individual directors were sued and had to pay. So most of the time, the business judgment rule, the company's balance sheet, the company's insurance company does not put you at financial risk. So I think sometimes that's overblown now. If you had $100 million and didn't want to put that at risk, maybe you shouldn't join boards because there is a chance you get sued. As we know, in the context of acquisitions or in the context of missing earnings in a public company context, there are lawyers and law firms that look for those opportunities and will sue boards. They typically get settled for nominal amounts and everybody goes home. In a private company, again, you want to know there's D and D&O insurance, but the risks are so much different because you don't have those large number of stakeholders around the globe.
I think on top of that, Sven, one thing I notice in private companies, especially multi-generational families, it's a little bit stickier and messier with because your shareholders are really tight, but they're not. But because if they're third, fourth generation, they may have different ideas of what has to happen. So you definitely, I agree with Sven. You need D&O insurance. You need to, and oftentimes the board is there to help not settle family disputes, but to give actually a seal of approval of the management team that they're doing the right thing, so the family members can't go back and forth on it as well. That's the biggest challenge, I think. And then I guess the other area is ESOPs. We do a fair amount of work with ESOPs, and so every employee is a shareholder, and so that becomes as well. So once again, the independent directors have to know why they're there and what their responsibilities are and get covered for it as well.
So Sven, again, thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here. I feel honored that you're here because you and I are both friends as well as business contacts. And one of the things I'm drawing from our kind of personal talks is your self-professed board mantra is no surprises. You've mentioned it several times to me. It's not something that I'm ever going to forget. It's something that you are known for and take pride in being known for that. Talk about how that became to be, and why is it so prominent for you?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, my middle name, I tell some people, is No Surprises, to stress how important it is. So I started board work a long time ago, and I didn't really know what the job was. I had to sort of feel my way through it, learn from that experience and this experience. But to bring the story forward, in 2008, I joined the board of SPS Commerce here in town. SPS was getting ready to go public, which actually happened in 2010. And there was a crusty old VC on that board at the time. His first name was George. And he turned to me and said, well, now that you're here, Sven, you're going to keep us out of trouble, right? And I thought, damn, how am I going to do that? And it wasn't that I was ignorant of the responsibility before joining the board. That's why I was recruited. I had done audit committee work elsewhere, but it really brought into sharp focus for me what the job was. And I realized that since the audit committee only meets half a dozen times a year, right? How do I disseminate a message? How do I communicate with all these folks what the expectations are of the audit committee? And remember, you're dealing with the auditors, the partner, the manager, the senior, and the staffs. At the company, you're dealing with the CFO, the controller, head of accounting, whatever the various titles are, all the way down to the accounts receivable clerk that's been there just 2 weeks. Not to speak of my fellow audit committee members, right? So there's a lot of people involved in this process. And I concluded that I needed to have a message that would resonate, that would be clear, that I could repeat. I happen to believe that all good leaders do that. They have messages that resonate, are clear, and they repeat all the time. And so whenever I've had the opportunity, particularly when I speak to the entire accounting finance department, which I like to do once a year, haven't done it in COVID times, but historically have done that. I thank them for their work. But then I raise myself up a little bit and I say, look, we're the business is no surprises. If we're having an audit committee meeting on a Monday and the company's announcing earnings on a Wednesday, we can't have surprises on the Monday. So you as a accounts receivable clerk, or you as an audit partner, or you as the CFO, you owe it to the process. You owe it to everybody who's involved. No surprises. Let me say it again, no surprises. So I think, Rick, if you were to do a survey of people that have worked with me in town on finance stuff, they would all say, what does Sven stand for? Well, he stands for professionalism above all else. But in terms of the audit committee in particular, no surprises. And I feel like, frankly, that message has worked really well. People play it back to me. People have analyzed problems and brought things forward well in advance of that audit committee meeting because they understand that no surprises are really painful, put everybody in a very difficult position, and can cause a tremendous amount of stress. Now, you live long enough, there will be a surprise because not everything emerges weeks in advance. But right. It's a message that I think bears repeating, and then by extension can be used at the board level as well. But the genesis of it, where I've used it with the greatest effectiveness, is at the audit committee level.
So Sven, have you used it with your wife?
I've used it with my 3 young adult children.
Good move.
My wife, Jim,
or maybe your wife uses it with you.
Well, there you go. There you go. We're all, alas, old enough that I suspect we've surprised each and everybody in our lives more than once.
Yes, exactly. So, Sven, what's the hardest part about serving on a corporate board? Without naming names, tell us about the hard part. Give us some examples of, like over the years that has happened with you.
Jim, this is a tough one because what I would do is I would restate the question this way. I say, what are the worst board experiences I've ever had? What are the board experiences that have kept me up at night?
Okay.
Where I've had to go downstairs at 3 o'clock in the morning, where I happen to believe that writing things down sometimes helps clear your thinking. So I've had, both in the not-for-profit world and in the for-profit world, some really bad board experiences. They tended to be with bad people, people that are not trustworthy, people that are not professional, people that care only for themselves and not their larger sphere of influence. So as I sit here, I can think of those people, Jim, and I still sometimes, if I believed in voodoo, I would find my voodoo doll and stick a needle in them. But those are the ones that come, and of course, as we all know from studies, we tend to remember some of those bad events more than we remember the good events. And I've been doing this long enough across a sweep of companies and organizations. And so, yes, I've had some of those, but it comes back to the guy or number two or number three.
How about you?
So when we were working on these questions and talking amongst ourselves about doing these interviews, and I thought about this, and I kind of thought kind of a gradation, almost a scale of minor irritant of agreement. And frankly, if that's done in a healthy professional manner, that's all good. So kind of phase one is your debate, disagreement. Phase two, I guess I've seen some people talk too much, kind of have the smartest person in the room syndrome, and really don't have very good EQ around what's happening in the boardroom. Some people maybe are a little quieter than others, and you have to give them space to talk. Some people you can tell are ready to chime in, and if you talk too much, you take their airtime. So kind of phase two or gradation two were the folks that behave like that. Then I think the next layer up are the folks that frankly don't work too hard. Sven talked a little bit about, unfortunately, like Sven, most of the people I've worked with have been very professional and things have functioned in a healthy manner. But there are some folks that view the board stops as a check on the resume and a filler for time, and not really viewing it like a job and dedicating themselves like Sven has. And so people who maybe don't do as much work, maybe a few mistakes because they're not as knowledgeable, not digging in. Generally speaking, I would say the intentions are good generally, but just maybe aren't at the quality you would like. So that's kind of phase three. Phase four, and Sven touched on it, bad person. Usually something is amiss. Might just be being self-centered, might be being self-serving, could be borderline unethical, best case, illegal, worst case. And so I think there's kind of a spectrum of things that go from healthy interaction to people behaving inappropriately and maybe illegally. And fortunately for me, haven't had too many of the negative experiences.
Yep.
Yeah, I had a guy years ago, I'll never forget, it was an audit committee, smaller company. This was a point in time when not everything was being uploaded to your iPad. So we were getting hard copies in advance of the meeting. And this guy walked into the audit committee meeting opening the package. And I said, hey, really? You're showing up and you haven't even, you could fake it, open it in your car.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm curious about, I agree with both of you said but I would think, Sven, and you probably have had this in your career, having 70 years of it, a CEO change. So you really, one of the jobs of a director is hiring and firing CEO. That's one of the many things. But CEO changes really got to be, and it might not even be for the bad reason, it might be for the good reasons or whatever. Any of that have you worked with?
I have multiple times. Most recently at Protolabs, public company here in town.
Yep.
Where Vicki Holt, who joined the company in 2014, retired here just at the end of last month. And she gave us plenty of notice, and there was a plan, and we executed on the plan, and we promoted Rob Bedore, an insider, to become CEO. But those of us who were intimately involved in that work, I was a member of the Nominating Governance Committee that took the lead. We described it to each other, it's God's work. It's probably the most important thing we do.
Yeah.
I touched earlier on the importance of doing the compliance work because that's part of what you do. But in terms of value add and getting it right, there's probably nothing more important than hiring, firing, cajoling, giving the CEO a pat on the back when he needs it, she needs it, or giving them a little bit of a nudge when they need that as well. So yes, I would put that at the very top of every list.
Yeah. How about director reviews? I mean, have you been involved with the 360 reviews? So you everybody's evaluating each other on the board level. It's often talked about. I don't feel like it gets done very often.
Right. It does not, because
I don't feel it does.
It does not,
Yeah.
because frankly, it's a scary thing to do.
Yeah.
In my experience, most boards do overall board evaluations. So I'm not commenting on your performance, Jim, or Rick's performance, or Susie's performance. I'm coming out on the board as a whole. Some of the good governance types would demand, recommend, suggest that there be individual evaluations of each director every year. In my experience, it gets discussed, and generally boards prefer not to do that because it obviously opens up the proverbial can of worms. Could lead to some tricky dynamics.
Yeah.
So it's typically not done.
Say
Okay.
Jim, want to just jump in on that question. I'd be curious what you've seen with your companies on that. We just did a 360-degree view at one of my portfolio companies of a CEO, and they did, I want to say, like 12 people in the company. So we had the board, and then we had key managers and stuff. And I was amazed at how tight the responses were across the various components. And I also felt good that my view was in line kind of with everybody else's. So for the CEO, I thought that was extremely valuable. We talked to at that company and are going to do it for the boards, but that's something that we're going to be working on this year. So I, like Sven, would say that have not seen it at the board level, but we're at least at this company moving toward that. Jim, what have you seen?
Well, I'm with Sven. It's talked about. It's kind of best practices, but when it comes down to the board level, it's because board members need to be diverse, but they need to be collegial, because you got to get along in this meeting, but you got to be able to have a voice. And I've found that it's everybody thinks it's a good idea, but nobody wants to do it. And the other part of it too is I'm a little bit cautious these days because of the cancel culture that we now move in, that's just because you don't like where how one board member does this or does that or doesn't talk enough or whatever. I think if you are going to do it, I would say you do it every couple of years at the board level. Every year would be too volatile, in my opinion.
Now, I have a friend who was a CEO a decade ago.
Yep.
And there was a hard-charging new board member who sort of took control. And he had a very simple system. He asked everybody to rank every director from 1 to 6, and whoever got the lowest score had to leave. No fuss, no muss, no nuance, no recognition of other contributions or diversity. It's just so you can have some simple systems.
Yeah.
I think in today's
Sven, we've been talking about these, maybe some of the more challenging parts of board work, but you have to to have done 70 years, there must be some joy there for you. Where do you get your biggest joy from doing board work?
So I've had the good fortune of talking with both of you over the years, and I think you both know that I really like my board work. I find it intellectually always interesting. I love alliteration. I find it in the same theme, socially stimulating. And it's how I make my living. And then on the not-for-profit side, as Rick was kind enough to point out, I've done government, I've done politics, I've done schools, I've done arts. I haven't done anything the last couple of years because I had a health issue, but I brought some of those skills to bear in the not-for-profit world. So it's just been a lot of fun to be with really smart people, to be at the center of what's going on and working on stuff that really matters. And I've had a lot of fun with it as well. Life is too hard, last year being a prime example, not to have some fun while you're doing it. Yeah. So across the sweep of what I've been part of, I would say I've tried really hard to contribute, but enjoy the ride as I go.
Yeah, if I think about it, Sven, you look at the 3 public companies you're on now have been big winners as well. I mean, that it's fun to be winning, isn't it? I mean, they've just done such a fabulous job of growing their businesses.
Yes. Uh, Perhaps not everybody on this call is a sports type person, but yes, if you're going to play the game, it's more fun to win than to lose.
Yeah.
And to the extent that one is lucky enough to get some equity, that's a win as well. But I also like what Archie Black, the CEO of SPS Commerce, likes to say. He's got a catchphrase. Remember what I said earlier about having catchphrases that people can latch onto? Archie uses this phrase: win today, win tomorrow. So if you don't win today, your shareholders are going to beat you up, or there'll be morale issues. But it can't be just about winning today. You've got to think longer term. You've got to think about what you're doing for your employees, for your customers, and then, of course, your shareholders as well. So yes, winning's important, but I like Archie's construct: win today, win tomorrow.
A reminder to our audience, we have a couple minutes left. If somebody had another question that they'd like us to ask, please hit us up through the comments field in YouTube. Gentlemen, you both have done some interesting things with your careers, seen a lot of different companies, different experiences, some good, some not so much. As you look back on your career, was there an important lesson that you learned that you wish you would have learned sooner?
Jim, do you want to take that first?
I just like what you just said about what Archie Black said, is win today, win tomorrow. I mean, that is a really good, I really like that saying, because that's what I wish that, it seems like when you're younger, you only think about today. You only think about today. And as I've gotten older, I've looked at more to the future. That's definitely something I feel strongly about.
Yeah. Rick, I've sort of seized upon two things as I think about that question, and you and I have talked about these kind of things offline occasionally. The first word I would use would be intention or intentionality. I frankly was not very intentional at various points in my career. I wasn't necessarily self-aware. I didn't have a good friend like you to help me think things through. And so I just sort of bounced from pillar to post. It all sort of worked out in the grand scheme of things. But as I look back, as I try to fall asleep some nights, I wish I had been more, again, intentional. So if I was in my 20s, my 30s, I've got 3 young adult children. I've shared that word with them a lot. The other thing I'd leave you and the group with is mentoring. Again, as I reflect back on my career and life, I've been very lucky to have mentors all the way. I had mentors at Cooper's Library back when I was a staff B accountant making $11,800 a year. I still remember the number. But I had a mentor when I first started board work, and a man by the name of Dick Perkins, affectionately known in town as Perk. Perk is now deceased. So between the beginning and the end, if you will, there's always been people that have helped me, and helped me in a gracious, generous way. Sometimes I worked that relationship. Sometimes it was more accidental. But in any case, it's so hard. It's so hard, in my view, to do it on your own. You need help, which is why we should mentor people that are younger than we are. We should mentor women. We should mentor minority groups that don't have some of the advantages that we as white males have.
So as we look at our talk today, and again, just a reminder for everybody, when we were putting together our list of questions, it was so long we weren't going to be able to fit it all in one session. So Sven has been gracious enough to agree to come back and do another interview with Jim and I. So we'll have a part 2 coming up shortly. But as we look across this interview here today, if you had one key takeaway to share with our audience, what would that be and why?
I'd say what Sven said is, take the work seriously. If you're blessed enough to be asked to serve on a board, take it seriously, think of it as work, and show up prepared as well.
I'll build on that, but take a slightly different theme. Board work's great. It's great in the not-for-profit world. It's great in the private company world. It's great in the for-profit public company world. So if you have an opportunity during your career to join a board, I would encourage you to do it. It's a way to learn. It's a way to make a buck. It's a way to give back. It's a way to hang out with some smart people. Don't embrace it. Don't run away from it. Even if one has a little bit of hair. Some people that I know that perhaps don't see it, don't come along very often. Boards don't turn over. So if one sort of crosses your screen, figure out a way to get on that board.
Well, Sven, thank you again for joining us today. I appreciate all that you've done for me, both personally and professionally. I know that you and I have talked about some of the boards that I've gotten on, and you've pushed me to join them. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. Gentlemen, if somebody in our audience wanted to reach out to you, how would they find you?
Best way for me is my email, jimz@cardinalboardservices.com.
And for Sven, it's my personal email, Sven Wehrwein at Comcast.net. As you indicated at the outset, Rick, I work out of my home office at this point. It seems to work pretty well.
All right. Well, again, thank you both very much for joining us today. Look forward to part number 2. And thank you for both of you for all that you do for me. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Rick.
Good day. Good day, everybody.